"Shut up. You're nothing but trash dressed as a witness," Miller bellowed, his face flushed red, leaning in close to Amara. No one in the room moved. The judge looked down, silent like an accomplice. Amara didn't flinch, her voice low and tight with anger. "Your mouth might chew up the truth, but it can't swallow me." A heavy hand came down, and the sharp crack of the slap exploded through the room. The entire courtroom felt like it had just witnessed a public crime, and yet no one dared to speak. The hallway of the Riverstone County Courthouse was lit by harsh white light, reflected off fluorescent bulbs lining the high ceiling, casting a cold and soulless atmosphere. The walls were coated in a dull gray paint, marked by thin cracks that ran like traces of time, while the glossy tiled floor was stained with footprints from the endless flow of people. The sharp echo of hurried footsteps filled the air, loud but heavy, each step bouncing off the long, narrow space like a constant reminder that warmth had no place here. The corridor was packed with people, most dressed in dark suits, carrying leather briefcases or stacks of documents, but no one looked at one another, eyes glued to papers as if trying to avoid the world itself. The smell of old paper, mixed with the metallic scent from the courtroom doors, created a dense atmosphere as if one had stepped into a submarine chamber where even oxygen felt heavier than usual. In that scene, Amara Lewis walked with a calm composure, holding a slim file in her hand, eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door leading to courtroom number 3. Her footsteps echoed clearly through the crowded corridor, but no one made room. They sidestepped her like her presence was something that didn't belong. Her face was serene, but her deep-set eyes carried a steel-like glare, a kind of light that unsettled those used to looking down on others. From the opposite end, Officer Miller approached slowly. His dark blue uniform clung to his broad frame, epaulets glinting with symbols of authority, and his polished shoes struck the floor with a rhythmic thud that pounded in the ears of anyone who heard. He stopped directly in front of Amara, his icy blue eyes scanning her from head to toe like a blade. His mouth curled into a sneer before he muttered with slick disdain, "Court isn't for people like you." That voice dropped into the crowded hallway like a bucket of ice water, clear, piercing, and venomous. A few people nearby glanced up in surprise, then quickly looked down, pretending to shuffle papers. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of retreating footsteps from those eager to escape, as if even lingering could be a mistake. A few young attorneys paused briefly, flicking a look at Amara before turning away, shoulders tightening. They had heard, but chose the silence of accomplices. In their eyes, that racially charged jab might as well have been an unspoken command to stay out of it. Amara stopped, standing face to face with Miller, without a flinch, without a frown. She drew in a deep breath, letting it move through her chest like she was flushing the toxins from the air around her. For a fleeting moment, her eyes locked directly onto Miller's, steady and unyielding. Her voice rang out, clear and precise, each word a sharp, clean blade. "Truth belongs to everyone." The space around them fell silent, Amara's reply tearing through the thick veil of quiet that had smothered the hallway. It wasn't loud, but it carried an unusual weight, the kind that made those who had just looked away suddenly feel ashamed. A few curious glances lifted, only to quickly retreat when they met the icy stare of Miller. In a blink, the atmosphere shifted, Amara's calm standing in stark contrast to the officer's aggression, forming a tension that crackled like static before a lightning strike. Miller hesitated, the corner of his mouth twitching with rage. He wasn't used to having his words met with steady defiance. He expected fear, expected downcast eyes, trembling hands, and a faltering voice. But what he received was unwavering calm, a firm voice, and absolute clarity. He stepped in closer, cheap cologne wafting thickly around him, his tone dropping lower, sharp as a blade pointed at the heart. "Careful, lady. Silence might save you." Those nearby flinched slightly. Someone shook their head, but all quickly pretended not to hear. The silence in the hallway grew heavier, a dense wall of avoidance pushing Amara to the edge of a crowd that was desperate to separate itself from the truth. Every lowered gaze, every diverted step was an admission. They were siding with power over justice. Amara remained upright, her hand gripping the file tightly, knuckles pale, but her voice steady, rising like a declaration. Silence doesn't protect anyone. Her eyes didn't stay on Miller. They swept across the bowed heads in the crowd, as if to remind them that their silence was the fertile ground where evil thrived. A long pause followed, the air thick and breathless, before new footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, signaling that the hearing was about to begin. Miller glanced around, noticing several eyes watching him and Amara, even if only briefly. His face tightened. A faint smile returned, laced with menace. Then he stepped aside, clearing the path but never breaking eye contact. His stare clung like claws, bitter and venomous, a silent promise that whatever happened inside the courtroom would be far more brutal. Amara stepped forward, striding straight toward the large wooden door. Her pace was neither fast nor slow, but deliberate, each step landing with a steady echo that drowned out the murmurs behind her. She didn't look back, but she knew Miller was still watching, his gaze clinging to her like a shadow pressed against every beat of her heart. When her hand touched the cold steel handle, the hallway seemed to freeze for a second. Then the noise returned. Footsteps, coughing, the rustle of paper, all scrambling to fill the silence left behind by their exchange. Just before Amara pushed the door open, a quiet voice rose from the corner of the hallway, trembling but firm, the voice of a young law student standing in the crowd. "She's right. Truth does belong to everyone." The words were quickly drowned by murmurs of disapproval, but they echoed in Amara's mind like a flicker of signal, proof that somewhere within the silence a seed of courage still survived. The heavy door slowly creaked open, the screech of its hinges sharp and strained like a long-suppressed cry. Inside, the solemn darkness of the courtroom waited, a place where accusations would rise, where power would challenge truth, and where Amara knew every breath she took would be scrutinized to its core. She stepped through the threshold, letting the door close behind her with a dull thud that seemed to mark the beginning of something irreversible. The sound sealed off the noise of the hallway, leaving only the cold hush of the chamber ahead. Without pausing, Amara moved toward the center of the room, the file still gripped tightly in her hand, her face steady, her back straight. She knew what was coming, and she was ready. The sound of the heavy wooden door closing behind Amara shut out the harsh, white light of the hallway, giving way to the dim solemnity of the courtroom. The space was large, yet compressed. Rows of dark, aged benches packed tightly together, fluorescent lights overhead casting a cold glow that washed every face pale. Papers rustled quietly among soft coughs, and the room felt like a sealed box holding the breath of dozens of people, all eyes drawn to the witness stand at the center. Amara stepped toward it, quietly placed her file down, took a deep breath, and looked straight ahead at the judge. The judge sat elevated above all, black robe draped over him, his face expressionless like carved stone, eyes hidden behind round glasses that revealed nothing. He tapped his pen lightly on the folder in front of him to signal the start, his voice hoarse but firm. "Witness, state your name." Amara answered clearly, her voice carrying through the room. "Amara Lewis." The clerk's typewriter clacked to life, its rhythm joining the tapping pen like a cold mechanical heartbeat. No sooner had she spoken than a loud scraping sound came from the right side of the courtroom. Officer Miller, face flushed and eyes wide, suddenly sprang to his feet. He waited for no cue, his thick arm shot forward, finger trembling with either rage or the pretense of it, and his voice roared through the chamber. "She destroyed the evidence." The accusation burst forth without proof, without reference, yet was delivered with the certainty of a verdict. The courtroom trembled, chairs shifted slightly, murmurs rippled outward, and heads turned sharply toward Amara, stares pinning her like sharpened arrows. A lawyer, seated in the front row, flinched, opened his mouth as if to speak, then bit his lip and flipped through the file in his lap, pretending to check documents. Others followed suit, some folding their arms, others looking down, avoiding eye contact. Their silence was heavier than words, turning the room into Miller's stage. The chamber tilted under a wave of suspicion, yet no voice rose in defense. The judge frowned, his hand hovering over the gavel, lips moving slightly as if to speak, but then he paused. He looked at Miller, then at Amara, his gaze softening before drifting away, as if deciding the best response was to pretend he had seen nothing. The gavel remained untouched. No sound to restore order, no reminder of protocol. In that moment, the full authority of the court hung suspended, leaving the floor to raw intimidation. Amara could feel the stares pinned to her like hundreds of invisible hands trying to shove her off the witness chair. Her breath slowed. Her lips pressed together for a brief second, then parted with a calm voice, each word sharp, not loud, but cutting enough to land in every ear. Show proof, not your prejudice. The room seemed to pause, her words slicing through the baseless accusation and exposing the shamelessness of the man standing before her. Miller froze for a moment, then let out a harsh, mocking laugh. It echoed, sharp and stinging, half ridicule, half threat. He shook his head, hands on his hips, voice dropping low. Proof? I don't need proof when everyone can see what kind of person you are. His words landed heavy, digging into race and bias, stirring another wave of whispers through the room. Some leaned in to murmur, others at the back nodded subtly. Miller's trap didn't need evidence. It fed off prejudice that had always been there. Amara looked him dead in the eye, unblinking, her voice lower this time, but even sharper. Your eyes see only what your hatred tells them. The words weren't loud, but each fell into the room like a carved truth, pressing into the silence, making a few listeners shift uncomfortably. Behind her, a young female witness pulled back slightly, eyes reflecting quiet sympathy, though still choosing silence. The judge frowned again, his hand tapping gently on the desk, a sound too faint to drown out Miller's sneer. He glanced down at his papers, avoiding Amara's eyes. In that moment, truth became the abandoned guest, forgotten and unwanted, while the accusation stood tall in the center of the room that was supposed to serve justice. Miller stepped closer, his voice rising to a near shout. She's lying. People like her twist the truth. They always do. The courtroom jolted once again, the noise crashing against the closed walls like a wave. Those seated in the gallery bowed their heads even lower, as if looking down might shield them from the truth, from the responsibility of facing the injustice unfolding before them. Amara sat still, shoulders straight, gaze steady. She knew every word she said could be twisted, every reaction used as a weapon against her, but she also knew silence was never salvation. Her voice rang out once more, cutting through the thick air. I came here for the truth. If you fear it, then maybe you are the one destroying it. A heavy silence fell, not the quiet of peace, but of guilt, of mouths sealed by fear, of eyes refusing to meet the truth. The clerk paused his typing for a second, hands trembling slightly, then resumed, as if his task mattered more than the fact that a baseless accusation had just been unleashed. Miller didn't respond right away. He took a deep breath, chin lifted high, eyes flashing with the look of someone who had just been challenged on his own turf. Then he let out a dry laugh and turned to the crowd. See? She talks back. She's arrogant and disrespectful. That's the kind of witness she is. His words slid into the ears of everyone, cornering Amara within the trap he had built, turning self-defense into wrongdoing, turning honesty into attitude, turning a woman fighting for justice into someone suspicious. Amara clenched her fists, nails digging deep into her palms until blood surfaced, but her voice stayed calm and cold. Disrespect is striking someone in court. Disrespect is turning silence into approval. Her eyes scanned the room, catching many avoiding her gaze, then fixed on Miller, staring through him like a spear piercing the uniform of power he wore. In that moment, the entire room sank into suffocating tension. No one spoke, no one stood with Amara, yet no one could deny the truth shining through every word she said. That truth wasn't enough to free her from the trap Miller had set, but it was enough to shake the false walls enclosing the room. Amara remained seated, back straight, eyes unmoving. She knew the real battle had only just begun, and every word that followed would determine the fate not just of her, but of the truth being smothered smothered in that courtroom. The air inside the courtroom remained thick after Miller's accusation, every gaze on Amara tinged with suspicion or deliberate avoidance. Just as silence threatened to settle again, Miller twisted his mouth into a mocking grin, the contempt in it unmistakable. He leaned back, then stepped forward, his voice loud, clearly aiming to pull the whole room into his orbit. "This isn't some Harlem street fight. Speak properly, woman." His tone rang out heavy with ridicule, lingering on the word Harlem, carving it into the collective consciousness like a blade meant to shame. The moment he finished, a few chuckles slipped out, scattered at first, then spreading like ripples. Snickers, sneers, even a throat-cleared laugh echoed slightly louder, as if to reward Miller's jab. The sound bounced off the dark wooden walls, turning the already tense air suffocating. It wasn't just laughter, it was complicity, an unspoken agreement that racially loaded mockery had a place in this room that was supposed to uphold justice. Amara remained still on the witness stand, shoulders unmoving, back upright, like a pillar holding up the entire space. Her eyes locked on Miller's without flinching or lowering. There was no fear in them, only a cold, focused resolve. She spoke slowly, her voice ringing clear, each syllable pressing against the cramped silence. "I came here to testify, not to entertain your bias." Her tone wasn't raised or harsh, but its calm held weight and defiance. Her response made the courtroom fall silent for a beat. Eyes shifted uncomfortably, some with confusion, others with unease. A man in a suit at the front row licked his lips, gripping the file in his hands as if to squeeze out his discomfort. A middle-aged woman behind him furrowed her brow, her eyes drifting toward Amara as if, for the first time, realizing this wasn't a witness easily cornered. Miller curled his lip, his face twitching slightly. He hadn't expected Amara to answer like that, especially not with such steady confidence. His blue eyes flashed with anger, but he forced his voice to stay level, dripping with mockery. "Entertain? You think you deserve respect here?" He turned toward the gallery, like a performer needing applause, raising his voice. "This is a court, not a stage for her pride." A few dry laughs broke out again, sparse but sharp enough to turn the insult into a spectacle. The laughter didn't last, but it was enough to poison the atmosphere further. People chose to laugh instead of face the truth, chose to laugh to turn the victim into a punchline, chose to laugh so they wouldn't have to stand and call out what was plainly wrong. Amara took a deep breath, her eyes cold and steady as they swept across the room. She wasn't just answering Miller, she was answering the crowd that had bowed its head, sneered, and laughed. "Justice isn't served by your laughter," she said, her voice sharp and clean, "and silence won't erase what happened here." Her words made a few people stop laughing, their expressions stiffening, their eyes quickly shifting away. In that moment, the judge finally struck the gavel. The sound of wood on wood echoed dryly, a neat little tap meant to restore order, but it was too soft, lacking force, more of a gesture than an actual interruption. He frowned, glanced at Miller, then at Amara, but said nothing to rebuke either. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, tired eyes hidden behind his glasses, silently allowing Miller to continue. Miller noticed it, and a cold smile crept onto his face. He had received the unspoken permission to press on with the humiliation. His footsteps landed evenly on the wooden floor as he approached the witness stand. "Tell me, Miss Lewis," he said, dragging out his words, "is this how you think a proper witness should behave? With arrogance? With defiance?" He stressed the word arrogance, his stare aimed at casting Amara as insolent. Amara did not lower her head. She tilted her face slightly, the cold white light catching her cheekbone, sharpening every angle of her expression. Her reply was brief, firm, unwavering. "Defiance is what survives when respect is stripped away." The sentence landed hard in the thick air, stilling the murmurs for a moment. The judge struck the gavel again, still too softly, still ineffective. A flicker of discomfort passed across his face before fading back into neutrality, as if the safest option was to let Miller control the moment. His silence had become Miller's shield. shield, turning a personal attack into something that looked official. In that instant, Amara understood. This was no longer a courtroom seeking justice. It was a stage for prejudice and power. She gripped her file tighter, knuckles pale, but her gaze held firm. Her final words in this exchange rang out, calm but cutting like a hammer on falsehood. "I testify for truth, not for your comfort." No one applauded, no one nodded, but the room fell into a long, heavy pause, and in that silence, even those who had laughed felt something inside them quietly exposed. The air inside the courtroom grew thick after Miller's latest round of mockery. The gavel's strike, expected to silence the disorder, rang out weakly, a hollow sound that told everyone in the room the line between justice and abuse of power was being stretched to a dangerous point. Amara remained upright, her cold, sharp gaze locked on Miller, while he chose not to retreat but to advance, each heavy step a declaration of control over the room. Miller stopped directly in front of the witness stand, his breath reeking of cigarettes and malice. He leaned in close, his voice low, but each word cut like a thin blade through the tense air, slicing into Amara's ears. "Answer, or I'll teach you how." His words weren't loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, but the chill and threat in his tone sent a shiver through every nerve of those seated nearby. The clerk in the corner flinched, his hand freezing above the page mid-sentence. His eyes lifted briefly, catching the image of a police officer looming over the witness, posture aggressive and overbearing. His lips quivered, as if about to speak, but then clamped shut. He looked down again, pretending to resume his notes. The pen in his hand trembled, leaving smeared, uneven lines on the paper, a silent record of someone who witnessed but did not act. Amara stayed still, her body unmoving, but her eyes paused. She could feel the pressure in the narrow space between them, the acrid breath, the violence behind his stare. Anger surged inside her, but she held it down, focusing it into her gaze. Her eyes burned not with fear, but with tightly held fury, like a flame caged in steel. Tension exploded across the room, spreading like fire. Eyes turned toward the witness stand. A few leaned forward. Breaths shortened. The murmurs stopped, leaving a silence so complete the sound of heartbeats felt audible. No one spoke, but everyone understood. Something had just crossed a line. One more step, and the threat would turn to violence. The judge frowned, eyes flicking briefly to Miller, then slowly lowering to the folder in front of him. He tapped the gavel again, the sound faint, a weak signal in the middle of a storm. No warning, no firm response. That silence became a curtain, allowing Miller to continue parading his power in the very place meant to uphold the law. Miller leaned in a little closer, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the entire witness stand. His voice slid through clenched teeth, sounding like the grind of metal. "One more lie and you'll regret stepping into this room." It wasn't a question, it was a sentence. The words made those in the gallery behind Amara freeze, hands gripping their seats. The silence stretched endlessly, pulled so tight it felt like the smallest sound could shatter the entire room. Amara gripped the file tighter, her hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from anger held back. She took a breath, letting calm return, then lifted her chin and looked Miller straight in the eye. She didn't blink. Her stare cut through his aggression, speaking clearly that his power wasn't enough to extinguish the truth. Her breathing stayed steady, each heartbeat syncing with her resolve, and in that moment the entire room could see it. The threat failed to make Amara bow. A young man sitting toward the back, perhaps a law student, leaned slightly toward his seatmate, about to whisper something but swallowed the words. His eyes were tight, face pale, as if witnessing something completely at odds with everything law books had ever promised. The courtroom's silence was no longer order, but enforced complicity, a place where everyone knew something was wrong but turned away out of fear. The air grew denser, each second dragging like a century. Miller's overpowering presence, Amara's unwavering calm, and the crowd's fearful silence tangled together into a warped image of justice being squeezed out through old wooden walls. Everything seemed to brace for an explosion, and that explosion was building in every stare, every shallow breath. Amara tilted her head slightly, her voice cutting through the tension. not loud, but sharp as honed steel. Threats won't turn lies into truth. The line lit a few eyes, stretched a few faces in surprise. Miller blinked, a faint smile flashing, like someone just publicly challenged on his own turf. The tension reached its peak, the room suspended at the edge of a storm, every person feeling the weight of their own breath. In that moment, it became clear. The fragile boundary of justice had just been openly tested, and the clash between a resilient witness and an abusive officer had moved far beyond the rules. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the inevitable break. The air in the courtroom was so thick that each breath felt heavy in the chest. Miller still loomed over the witness stand, his figure blocking the cold ceiling light, casting Amara's face into partial shadow. His threat still echoed in the ears of the spectators, leaving behind a sting like a blade lingering in the air. Amara sat upright, her eyes holding back fury. Her voice had just cut through the silence like ice, making the tension even more suffocating. The whole room seemed to wait for an explosion, and it came faster than anyone could react. In the brief moment when the judge lowered his eyes to the file in front of him, Miller suddenly swung his arm. The slap cracked sharply, echoing off the cold walls, metallic and loud. It landed so hard that Amara's head snapped to the side, hair falling across her shoulder, her entire body rocking off balance. The sound tore through the tightly wound air, shaking the courtroom like the report of a gunshot. A streak of red bloomed at the corner of Amara's mouth, dripping onto the file in front of her. She gently touched her tongue to the bitter taste, but didn't cry out, didn't flinch. Her head turned back slowly, like a machine grinding against pain. Her deep black eyes fixed on Miller, not trembling, but glowing with the quiet heat of coals. Her voice came low, rasped through her lips, but each word cut the silence clean. "You just crossed the line of no return." Her words were not a protest. They were a declaration. A boundary had been crossed, and there would be no going back. The spectators in the back rows jolted. Eyes widened, a few people swallowed hard, some glanced at each other in confusion, but not one stood. Hands clenched armrests, lips trembled with unspoken words that died before reaching the air. Every attempt at resistance was crushed in the throat, leaving only the silence of complicity. Miller was panting, his face flushed, eyes wild at the unbroken defiance staring back at him. He had wanted collapse, fear, submission, but instead he faced eyes as still and sharp as steel, and a statement that could not be bent. The silence of the courtroom now only fueled his authority. He looked around, catching lowered heads, averted eyes, then smiled coldly, as if he had just proven that here he was the law. Amara didn't answer that smile. She sat tall, wiped the blood from her mouth with the back of her hand, her gaze steady and unshaken. She knew she had just become living proof of unchecked abuse. The sting on her cheek was nothing compared to the deeper pain of watching a room full of people bow to violence. But in her eyes, pride still burned, challenging the cowardice that surrounded her. The spectators continued to glance at one another, eyes flickering with unease, some pressing their lips together before quickly lowering their heads. A young man at the end of the row gripped his phone tightly, his eyes fixed on the scene before him, chest rising and falling with anger. He wanted to stand, to shout, but his trembling hand only tightened around the device as if it were the one thing keeping him in his seat. The middle-aged woman beside him gently placed a hand on his arm, her gaze pleading, a silent warning that one rash move could cost him a lifetime. The judge remained still, his hand trembling slightly around the gavel, but he didn't strike it. His eyes wavered, lingering briefly on the red streak at the corner of Amara's mouth, then dropped back to the file in front of him as if choosing to pretend he hadn't seen. That silence echoed through the room, louder than the slap, heavier than the threat, turning an act of violence into something normalized at the heart of a courtroom. Miller stepped back, chin raised, his eyes sweeping across the gallery with a silent dare. Who would object? No one spoke. A few turned their heads. Some dabbed sweat with handkerchiefs, all avoiding his gaze. The air had thickened so much that it seemed each person could hear the pounding of their own heartbeat. Amara drew a deep breath. The blood at the corner of her lips had dried, but her eyes still gleamed with cold fire. She knew this moment had burned itself into the memory of everyone present, no matter how hard they tried to stay silent. A single word could have saved her, but silence had already been chosen. The truth was clear. In this place, a slap could land, and no one would dare to stop it. That silence made Miller smile with satisfaction, his face relaxing as he folded his arms like a man who had won. But beneath that grin, a thin crack had formed. The whisper Amara had spoken, that quiet declaration, had planted a seed of resistance in the air. Those eyes that turned away might one day look back, and when they did, this slap would become a scar that would never fade. The courtroom sat frozen. Every person turned to stone. The soft rustling of papers from the clerk's desk sounded faint, but sharp, like a blade carving into wood. The clerk tried to keep writing, though his handwriting shook and blurred, his eyes shining with tears caught between duty and conscience. But, in the end, the pen kept moving, laying down thin, shallow lines that tried to bury a crime beneath routine. Amara sat upright, the blood on her lip already dried, her face calm. She said nothing more because her last words had already become a declaration. The room was thick with tense silence, where everyone had to face the truth that they had just witnessed something indefensible. That silence now meant guilt, and each person carried that weight on their shoulders. No one dared to intervene. No one dared to stand on the side of justice at that moment. But within that heavy silence, Amara knew the door that had been opened would not close easily. This slap had gone too far, and it would become a smoldering flame, waiting to ignite with more fury than any accusation ever could. The sound of the slap still echoed in the minds of the spectators, its aftershock squeezing the air in the room. Miller stepped back, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom in search of any sign of defiance, but all he found were bowed heads. Silence became a curtain, but among the crowd, one person couldn't stay still. At the end of the left row, a young law student named Daniel Hayes gripped his phone tightly. His heart pounded, palms so slick with sweat he almost dropped the device, but he carefully angled the screen toward the witness stand, the tiny lens beginning to record. The footage shook with his trembling hand, but the harsh white light from the ceiling clearly captured Amara's face, still streaked with blood. Daniel knew what he was doing was dangerous. Warnings echoed in his mind. If caught, he could be thrown out of the courtroom, even arrested for obstructing legal proceedings. But the fury in his chest outweighed the fear. He had studied justice, the Constitution, human rights, and what was unfolding before him stood in complete contradiction to everything he had learned. That slap wasn't just violence, it was a declaration that the law had been twisted by the hands of someone who abused power. Just as Daniel adjusted the angle, a rough, gravelly voice came from behind, firm and full of warning. A large man in a gray coat leaned down and spoke low enough for only Daniel to hear. "Stop, or you'll lose that phone." The tone was final. Not advice, but a veiled command lined with threat. Daniel stiffened, throat dry, eyes flicking toward the man's face. It was cold, unreadable, with a brief glance toward Miller that signaled any disobedience would be punished. Daniel's chest tightened, his fingers gripping the device so hard his knuckles turned white. He knew one wrong move and the phone would be snatched away, the evidence lost. For a moment, he considered shutting it off, sliding it back into his pocket for safety. But then, Amara's image filled the screen again. She sat tall, blood still visible at her mouth, her eyes fierce, unshaken. Her words echoed in his mind. "You just crossed the line of no return." It felt like a call aimed directly at him. He swallowed hard, tilted his head slightly, and whispered to himself, barely audible, "If no one speaks, at least the camera will." That quiet promise promise became the source of his courage, steady in his hand as he kept recording. The footage wavered, but every detail remained clear. The slap, the blood, the complicit silence, all of it captured in a few fleeting seconds, a living record against a system bowed in fear. Miller had no idea. He stood there, arms crossed, the smug expression still carved into his face, a cold smile curling at the corner of his mouth. He looked at Amara like a man who had already won, his eyes daring anyone to challenge him. The other spectators looked away, but not Daniel. Through the small lens, he saw the truth clearly. A woman assaulted in court, a police officer twisting power into mockery, and a room full of adults who had chosen silence. The clerk's shaky typing still echoed softly, but Daniel knew what he held was the real record. Not scribbled lines masking the moment, but images and sound, undeniable, unerasable by the quiet tap of a gavel. He looked down at the screen and saw every frame of Amara sitting tall, and he realized the footage wasn't just for her, it was for everyone outside, everyone who had no idea the truth was being buried within these four walls. A soft sound startled him. Daniel quickly lowered the phone to his thigh, pretending to shuffle the papers in his lap. The man in the gray coat was still watching, eyes sharp as blades, but eventually turned away. Daniel exhaled, his heartbeat erratic, but his fingers stayed pressed to the record button. He knew he was walking a tightrope, but he also knew this: once captured, the truth would find its way out. In the corner of the room, a few other students had noticed Daniel's actions. They weren't filming, but their eyes lit up, something flickering behind them. A black-haired girl next to him gave a slight nod and whispered, "Be careful." Daniel didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on the screen, capturing every movement, every detail. He felt the trembling in his hands become the heartbeat of the entire room. A small heart, but one pushing back against a suffocating force. Miller kept speaking. More venom, more jabs at Amara, but Daniel barely heard him now. He heard only his own pulse, the tremble of the image, and the whisper he'd just told himself. In that moment, he understood that courage wasn't shouting or slamming a desk. It was choosing to make sure the truth could be seen. The phone in his hand had become a silent witness, stronger than any sneer or insult. Amara, unaware she was being filmed, remained calm, proud, eyes forward, unshaken by pain. That image stayed captured in Daniel's unsteady grip, and he knew, someday soon, the world would see what this courtroom tried to hide. The tension in the room remained thick, silence nearly choking, but in that silence, the little phone had become another eye, one that dared to watch, to record, to defy a system shielding its own injustice. And Daniel, through a gesture that seemed fragile, had planted a seed that no power could erase. Night fell over the city of Riverstone in its usual quiet, the empty streets lit only by yellow streetlights, casting a glow onto cold sidewalks. But in one corner of the law school dormitory, a laptop screen glowed bright in a dark room. Daniel Hayes sat motionless in front of it, his hand trembling slightly as he finished uploading the video to social media. He chose the hour just before midnight, when the world believed it had gone to sleep, but he knew this was the perfect moment for the truth to begin its quiet journey. In the short description, he wrote just a few words: a slap in court, justice denied. Below it, he added the hashtag #, justice for Amara. The clock on the wall struck exactly midnight as the post button lit up and the video officially entered the endless stream of the internet. In that moment, Daniel closed his eyes and took a deep breath, as if shedding the weight he had carried all day. He knew this action could bring consequences, but the feeling of standing with the truth, of seeing a glimmer of light inside the dark, gave him the strength to accept whatever came. Within 10 minutes, the first notification popped up on his phone. A stranger had shared the video, adding a furious caption: "A cop struck her in court?" The question cracked like thunder in the night, launching a chain reaction no one could stop. Comments began to appear, scattered at first, then multiplying rapidly. "This is outrageous. How can a judge allow this? Justice has failed us again." Each line flowed across the screen like flames catching oil, spreading everywhere. Within an hour, the video had surpassed tens of thousands of views. Major Twitter accounts began paying attention, many of them independent journalists and social justice activists. They shared the clip with urgent calls to action. A well-known political commentator posted it with the caption, "If this can happen inside a courtroom, imagine what happens outside." Engagement skyrocketed, and the hashtag number Justice for Amara climbed into the trending list. By 2 in the morning, the explosion was out of control. Forums and online groups from all corners were consumed with discussion. People edited the footage, slowed down the moment of the slap, zoomed in on every flicker of an eye, every expression, to expose the raw violence and the complicit silence of the entire courtroom. One person wrote, "That slap didn't just hit one woman, it hit all of us." The sentence spread at lightning speed, repeated under every post, becoming a rallying cry impossible to ignore. Online media quickly joined the storm. Major news outlets published overnight, running bold headlines: "Shock in Riverstone Courthouse, Witness Assaulted by Officer." Some international publications began picking up the story too, featuring the image of Amara sitting upright with a streak of blood at her mouth on their front pages. Each article rang like an alarm, tearing down the wall of silence that Miller and his enablers had built inside that courtroom. By 4 in the morning, views had surpassed 500,000. People couldn't look away from the clip. Barely a minute long. It was short, shaky, but the truth was undeniable. The slap, the arrogance on Miller's face, the calm defiance of Amara, the chilling silence of the judge, all of it captured in a few seconds, yet enough to ignite outrage in millions. The wave of sharing kept rising. Influential accounts in the legal world, human rights activists, and even former military personnel reposted the video in unison. They called it evidence of justice collapsing, a warning that if a slap could happen inside a courtroom, no place was safe from abuse of power. Tweets came in waves, angry, despairing, forming a loud chorus bound by one message: Amara must be protected, and Miller must be held accountable. As dawn began to break in the east, early light slipping through the window, Daniel was still seated in front of his screen. He watched the view count climb, from hundreds of thousands to 500,000, then past 1 million in just 6 hours. His eyes were red from staying up all night, but his heart swelled with the belief that his small action had triggered a storm no one could stop. He whispered softly, a reminder to himself: the world knows now. Outside, Riverstone streets slowly filled with the rhythm of daily life again, but online, the tide had already risen. Justice for Amara was no longer just a hashtag. It had become a banner uniting millions of voices. And Amara, the woman who sat tall in the face of injustice, had become a symbol of truth breaking through the chains of silence. Just hours after the video surpassed 1 million views, the atmosphere in Riverstone began to shift. On the streets, in cafes, in classrooms, even in the courthouse parking lot, people were buzzing about the slap. The glow of phone screens had carried the truth beyond cold wooden walls, turning it into a topic no one could ignore. Public pressure surged, forcing the local government to respond. That same morning, the Riverstone Police Department hastily called a press conference, a rushed effort with a clear purpose: to protect Miller at all costs. The press room was packed. Camera flashes burst continuously as the department's spokesperson stepped to the podium, his face tense but his tone flat. The officer followed protocol. He declared firmly, repeating the word protocol like a shield. He explained that Miller acted in a high-stress situation and that he had the authority to maintain courtroom order. Behind him, a large screen displayed the department's dark blue emblem, projected as a symbol of legitimacy. The statement was met with immediate backlash. Outside the building, hundreds of citizens had gathered, holding signs with bold red letters, "Protocol never includes a slap." Their chants echoed down the street, louder than traffic. Inside the press room, reporters didn't stay silent either. A young journalist stood up and asked, "Can you cite the exact policy that allows an officer to slap a witness across the face in open court?" The spokesperson hesitated, glancing at the legal advisor next to him, then fumbled through vague language. His answer only fueled the anger, spilling out the doors and feeding the fire already burning. Online, the reaction was even fiercer. Thousands of tweets repeated the same phrase. "Protocol never includes a slap." The sharp, concise slogan became a dart aimed at the department's defense. Users spliced together images from the press conference and the slap itself, mocking the disconnect between words and reality. Each repost chipped away at the wall of denial the police were trying to build. As outrage grew, one voice stood out. A former U.S. soldier, a white man with silver at his temples, sat in his modest living room, turned on his camera, and recorded a short video. His eyes were steady, his voice deep. "That woman deserves respect, not assault. She stood there, calm and dignified, while an officer humiliated her. If this is what happens in court, what does it say about our country?" Within hours, his video was shared hundreds of thousands of times. People felt the weight of his words, not polished, not performative, just honest anger from someone who once wore the uniform to defend justice. The voice of that veteran swept through the movement like a strong gust of wind. Dozens of other former service members began speaking out, many posting photos of themselves in uniform with the caption, "We fought for justice abroad, not to see it destroyed at home." These messages turned the incident from a local courtroom controversy into a national reckoning over honor and values. The entire state quickly split into two clear sides. On one side, a wave of support for Amara, seeing her as a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. People took to the streets, holding signs with number "Justice for Amara," turning public squares into seas of protest. Songs of resistance were sung, chants echoed against the courthouse walls, spreading through every street corner. On the other side stood supporters of Miller and the police union, clinging to the claim that he was simply doing his job. They labeled Amara as disruptive and disrespectful, using those words to justify Miller's actions. These opposing views clashed fiercely, not only online but in daily life. In cafes, debates grew heated, with fists slamming tables. On college campuses, spontaneous discussions broke out. Students stood to speak their minds, some shouting in support of Amara, others objecting just as strongly, turning classrooms into battlefields of ideology. Even dinner tables were divided by the question, was Miller entirely wrong, or was there reason behind what he did? These small conflicts mirrored a larger fracture spreading through the state. Amara, in the eye of the storm, remained silent. She gave no interviews, posted nothing lengthy on social media, letting the video speak for itself. Her silence made her stand out even more. The image of a woman sitting tall under fire, blood on her lip, projected more strength than any explanation ever could. People saw in her a pride that had been violated but never broken. Miller, in contrast, avoided the press, appearing only in closed-door meetings with his union and defense attorney. Occasionally, photos of him entering the building surfaced, his face tense, jaw tight. These images didn't boost his support. Instead, they deepened public resentment, as people saw a man still clinging to arrogance despite the mounting backlash. Each day, the pressure grew. Public outrage moved beyond one officer and began to target the entire judicial system that had allowed the slap to happen without consequence. The same question echoed louder and louder. Where was the judge? Where were the lawyers? Why was everyone silent? These questions struck at the conscience of the public, forcing the entire state to confront a reality. The issue wasn't just one man, but a system that had allowed injustice to breathe. As night fell once again, protests continued across the major streets. The chant, "Justice for Amara," rang out, joined by drums and horns, forming a furious anthem for an entire community. On television, those images played on repeat, turning Riverstone into the nation's focal point. And in the chaos, Amara, once an anonymous witness, had become a symbol, while Miller, once an ordinary officer, had become a name cursed in every corner. What had started as public outcry was no longer a battle between two individuals. It had become a war between justice and complicity. And this time, the truth held the strongest weapon of all: outrage of millions. While the state remained divided over Miller's slap and the brazen cover-up by the police department, the press continued digging into the background of Amara Lewis. Amid vague reports and swirling rumors, an investigative journalist named Marcus Reed from the Riverstone Herald pursued every lead. He wasn't satisfied with the vague claims that Amara was just an ordinary witness. He saw something different in the way she held her back straight, her steady gaze, and the calm she maintained in the face of humiliation. Marcus began combing through public records, knocking on office doors, filing dozens of information requests, and on a gray, rainy morning, he received a thin folder from a military source. The printed words on the page left him stunned for several seconds, because they revealed a secret no one had expected. Amara Lewis was not just a random witness, not just a civilian caught in an unjust trial. In the file, her title was clearly printed: Commander, United States Navy SEALs. Marcus read it over and over, his eyes burning with disbelief. The next pages showed she had commanded a special operations unit in multiple overseas missions, earning numerous high honors, including the Distinguished Service Medal. The ID photo attached showed her in uniform, eyes sharp and proud. The woman who had been slapped in court, blood on her lips, was in fact one of the highest-ranking officers in the nation's elite military force. Marcus knew this information would explode across public discourse, but he also understood the risks of publishing it. Sitting at his computer, he typed the opening lines with a trembling hand. The woman in the viral video is not just a witness. She is Commander Amara Lewis of the Navy SEALs. The article went live at dawn, and within minutes, it spread at lightning speed. Other news outlets immediately picked it up, and morning broadcasts were updated in real time. The public was stunned and enraged because Miller's slap was now not just an act of violence against a black woman, but an affront to a military commander who had once defended the nation. Social media erupted into a storm. Statuses were posted in disbelief. He slapped a SEAL commander? That question became a flashpoint, with millions sharing it under the new hashtag #Commander Lewis. Accounts belonging to veterans, officers, and even retired generals quickly spoke out. A Marine Corps general posted on his personal page, "Commander Lewis is one of the finest officers we have ever had. To see her treated like this is an insult to every service member." That affirmation pushed the outrage even further, turning it from a state-level controversy into a national reckoning. The public began to understand that Amara's silence over the past days wasn't weakness, but the choice of someone disciplined by military life, someone who knew the truth would speak for itself when the time was right. Images of her in uniform flooded social media, placed side by side with footage from the courtroom, creating a stark contrast that made everyone shudder. On one side, a commander who had led units into battle; on the other, a victim of violence at the heart of justice. That truth could no longer be hidden, and any attempt by Miller or those backing him to justify their actions now rang hollow. As protests continued in the streets of Riverstone, news of Amara's true identity reignited the crowd like fuel to fire. New signs appeared: "Respect Commander Lewis," and "She fought for us, now we fight for her." Those voices echoed against the courthouse walls, forcing officials to confront the gravity of the situation as never before. What began as a local scandal had now become a symbol of the clash between justice and abuse of power, between human dignity and blatant contempt. Marcus Reed, the first to release the military records, sat in the newsroom watching the storm he had unleashed. He knew that from this moment on, Amara was no longer alone. The truth about her had shattered the chains of silence, turning her from victim to icon and transforming that slap in the courtroom into a blow aimed straight at the nation's conscience. Marcus's article, the moment it went live, hit the internet like a bomb. The sharp, concise headline, "The Cop Slapped a SEAL Commander," blazed across the homepage of the Riverstone Herald and was quickly picked up by major digital outlets. Social media users needed only a glance before sharing it widely, their comments laced with outrage. The image of Amara, in a navy dress uniform placed next to her on the witness stand, blood still on her lip, created a juxtaposition no one could ignore. Every share became an accusation, every comment another blow to the credibility of Miller and the system that had enabled him. Status after status filled the online world, repeating one question: how could this happen? People were furious not only at the slap but at the disgrace brought upon a SEAL commander in front of dozens of silent onlookers. Veterans from across the country spoke up, many recounting stories of serving alongside Amara or hearing of her reputation in the field. They called her brave, a model of discipline and loyalty. The assault on such a high-ranking officer was no longer just about racism or abuse of authority. It had become a symbol of justice in decay. Within just a few hours, public opinion had completely shifted. Those who were once hesitant, even leaning toward Miller's side, could no longer defend their arguments. Those who had previously covered for him were met with relentless questioning, even directly confronted. Did you know you were defending an assault on a SEAL commander? Chaos swept both social media and real life, as morning news broadcasts across major networks changed their schedules, opening with the bold headline, "National Outrage, Assault on Navy SEAL Commander in Court." In major cities, crowds began to swell in the streets. New slogans appeared on banners and signs: "Protect our commander" and "Justice for Amara Lewis." Her image, once that of a silent witness on the stand, now appeared on posters, T-shirts, becoming the face of a movement spreading across the nation. The protests no longer remained in Riverstone but reached the capital and multiple other states, where people saw this story as proof of abuse of power that any citizen could fall victim to. The public uproar swept beyond social networks and directly impacted the political arena. Many politicians were forced to speak out, from local representatives to members of Congress. Some condemned the incident outright, calling it a national disgrace, while others tried to strike a more neutral tone, but none could ignore it. Pressure from voters mounted, and hotlines to congressional offices were overwhelmed with calls demanding a full investigation and appropriate punishment. Meanwhile, Miller found himself increasingly isolated. The media surrounded him, digging into every detail of his past. Questionable records once buried began to surface, and each story of misconduct was brought to light. The name Miller had become synonymous with disgrace, while Amara Lewis emerged as a symbol of resistance, the focal point of a nation's attention. In just one night, the balance had tipped. The truth, once revealed, had swept away all efforts at justification, turning a wave of outrage from a small town into a nationwide storm. And as the chant, "Justice for Amara," echoed from thousands across the country's streets, no one could deny that this case had become a turning point in the history of American justice. The news of Amara Lewis's true identity spread so quickly that within a single day, every major media outlet had joined in. On CNN, the headline, "Commander Amara Lewis Assaulted in Court," ran prominently throughout the main broadcast, accompanied by a side-by-side image of her on the witness stand and a photo of her in Navy uniform. BBC followed suit, opening their morning report with a solemn introduction. A senior female officer of the Navy SEALs was assaulted inside a courtroom in the United States. News channels from Europe, Asia, and even the Middle East all reported on it, turning Riverstone from a small town into a global focal point. Those circulating images ignited public outrage on an unprecedented scale. People watched the news on giant screens in central squares, many shocked to learn that the witness wasn't just an ordinary woman, but someone who had once worn a uniform and led units in operations overseas. One question echoed through every conversation: how could this happen inside a courtroom? Storms of debate erupted on live television, where scholars, lawyers, and politicians clashed with fierce arguments. Some claimed it was the inevitable result of a justice system that had long tolerated abuse of power, while others emphasized it as a warning sign of racism still deeply rooted in society. While the entire nation erupted, Amara remained silent. She didn't appear on camera or participate in any interviews. The only thing she did was open a personal account and post a short line in white letters on a black background: "Truth has no color." That simple yet powerful sentence spread rapidly, with millions of shares within hours. It became a symbol, printed on banners, painted on walls, engraved on small placards held high during marches. The phrase became a torch, leading the outrage while planting in people a belief that justice knows no race or origin. Amara's silence didn't cool the public fire. It made her a figure of defiant pride. While Miller and the police department tried to counter with lengthy press conferences, their defenses were quickly drowned out by the weight of Amara's few simple words. The press described it as silence louder than 1,000 speeches, because it didn't justify or argue, it simply affirmed a clear truth. People saw in her the image of a woman who didn't need to shout to shake the very system built to crush her. The protests intensified. Riverstone's streets were filled day and night with chants, posters, and flags bearing her name. From social media to the evening news, her face and her words became inescapable. And in the midst of national reckoning, one thing was certain: Amara Lewis, once just a silent witness, had become the voice of a generation demanding justice. The shockwave crossed all borders. Major newspapers in London, Paris, and Tokyo simultaneously questioned the way the American legal system operates. Some international channels replayed the video repeatedly, treating it as proof that injustice still exists in a country that calls itself the beacon of justice. The U.S. government was forced to respond, with multiple White House spokespeople compelled to speak out, admitting the incident was being monitored at the highest level. It was as if the whole world was waiting to see how this nation would respond when one of its elite officers was publicly humiliated. In Riverstone, the atmosphere shifted. On the streets, people held up signs reading, "Truth has no color." The central square was packed, protesters chanting in unison, their voices echoing across the city. At the university where Daniel Hayes studied, hundreds of students gathered, replayed the video on a large screen, then recited Amara's words together like a pledge. The power of the community had surpassed fear, forcing local authorities to expand the investigation. In households everywhere, conversations about Amara became central. Children asked their parents why a commander was slapped in court, and parents struggled to find a satisfactory answer. Veterans held the national flag in their arms, tears falling as they watched a fellow service member be disgraced. Many said that the slap wasn't just aimed at Amara, it struck at them too, and at the very country they had sacrificed to defend. The event had grown beyond a scandal. It had become a test of the public's faith in the justice system. The phrase, "truth has no color," was no longer just tied to Amara, but had become a societal reminder. And as the nation trembled, every breath of public opinion, every pair of eyes, was fixed on the story unfolding in Riverstone, where justice was being tested in its most most brutal form. The rising wave of outrage made it impossible for local authorities to stay silent. The Riverstone Police Department was forced to announce Officer Miller's suspension press release filled with dry language, calling it a temporary measure pending investigation. Images of Miller walking out of the building, face tight, hands in his pockets, immediately appeared on numerous news channels. Protesters outside shouted furiously, many casting hateful stares as he left under the escort of fellow officers. The suspension did nothing to calm the crowd. Instead, it was seen as a belated admission that his actions were indefensible. On social media, millions of people continued asking why such a serious incident had resulted in nothing more than a temporary suspension. Comments poured in. This isn't punishment. This is just letting him hide. The public demanded stronger action. They wanted to see Miller brought to trial, not simply given a few weeks off. Online discussions erupted as lawyers, journalists, and activists all agreed the slap was not just an internal misconduct, but a public crime that must be handled by law. Meanwhile, Amara remained silent. She made no public appearances, gave no interviews, letting public outrage speak for itself. That silence only added pressure on the system, forcing all eyes to focus on the authorities. Newscasts played the video on repeat, intercut with footage of people flooding the streets, and Juarez chanting, "Justice for Amara." Even with Miller suspended, the marches didn't stop. In fact, they grew, as everyone knew a temporary decision could never count as justice. The pressure became so intense that the state court could no longer stay silent. Calls poured in from lawmakers, human rights groups, and voters. Finally, the state chief justice announced the launch of a federal investigation into the entire incident, meaning both the FBI and Department of Justice would be involved. The announcement came during a brief but explosive press conference. The spokesperson said, "We will investigate thoroughly, and no individual will be exempt." The crowd outside erupted into cheers, national flags raised high, and a flicker of belief in justice returned. Still, the outrage did not fade. Many saw this as a first step, but not nearly enough. They didn't want the investigation to be symbolic or dragged out until public interest waned. Red-painted messages reading, "No delay, no excuse," appeared on walls around the square, reflecting the people's determination. Debates inside the state legislature heated up, with some delegates openly calling for accountability from the judge, the clerk, and everyone who stayed silent in that courtroom. The pressure wasn't confined to Riverstone. It spread nationwide. National news outlets reported every development, with journalists closely following federal investigators. Miller was no longer just a suspended officer. He became a symbol of exposed abuse of power, a name tied to disgrace. Amara, with her simple phrase, "Truth has no color," became the face of belief in truth itself. The decision to open a federal investigation changed everything. It signaled that the matter had outgrown local control and could no longer be buried by protective hands. People knew the road ahead was long, but at the very least, that slap in court would not be forgotten. It had become the spark forcing the system to confront itself. And as chants echoed in the streets, people knew that this time, truth had finally grown loud enough for justice to hear. Right after the announcement of the federal investigation, black FBI vehicles appeared outside the Riverstone County Courthouse. The protesting crowd outside paused their chants as agents stepped out, jackets bearing the clear words "Federal Bureau of Investigation," standing out under the damp morning light. The already tense atmosphere turned solemn, as if an irreversible turning point had truly arrived. The agents moved swiftly inside, sealing off hallways and ordering all courthouse staff to vacate courtroom number 3. Yellow evidence tape was stretched across the heavy wooden doors, marking the place where the slap had occurred. now officially a protected crime scene. Stacks of thick case files on the clerk's desk, hastily typed transcripts, everything was seized. Sealed boxes were carried out under the watchful eyes of reporters, every agent's step captured by camera lenses. The very act of sealing the room sent a powerful message that, from this moment on, the evidence no longer rested in local hands, but with federal authorities, where the public hoped impartiality would be upheld. A team of technicians immediately inspected the courthouse's security camera system. Hard drives were carefully removed and packed into specialized containers. Just hours later, the first video extract was reviewed in a closed-door meeting, where investigators compared the footage to the viral clip. As the two recordings aligned, frame for frame, nods of solemn confirmation circled the table. The truth was undeniable. The slap had happened exactly as shown online, with no edits, no fabrications. The courthouse cameras, long dormant like forgotten surveillance tools, had become silent witnesses validating the outrage of millions. That confirmation quickly leaked, sparking a new wave of public discussion. News channels reported, federal source confirmed social media video matches courthouse security footage. The brief statement hit hard, silencing any claims that the clip had been doctored. Protesters cheered in the streets, calling it a first victory, while those who had defended Miller fell quiet. Amara remained private, avoiding the media. She stayed in a safe house, arranged by former comrades, watching events unfold from a distance. When she learned the video had been officially verified, she simply nodded, her eyes firm with resolve. For her, what mattered was not immediate gratification, but the steady progress of justice, beginning with the acknowledgement that truth could no longer be hidden, not for one more second. The police officers present at the hearing that day were quickly issued subpoenas by federal authorities. They entered the interrogation rooms with tense faces, no longer bearing the confidence they had while wearing their uniforms in court. The interrogation tables were cold, fluorescent lights casting harsh beams that forced each individual to confront the question. An FBI agent opened a thick file, voice calm yet firm. "You witnessed the slap. Why was it not mentioned in the court transcript?" The question was repeated across multiple sessions, drilling into every gap in their patchy testimonies. A few officers tried to deflect, claiming they didn't notice, only to be shown footage clearly placing them in the front row. Evasion became evidence against them. Some appeared so nervous that sweat ran down their foreheads, their statements broken. One officer, visibly shaken, confessed to receiving a directive from superiors instructing silence, warning that anyone who intervened in Miller's situation would be marked with disciplinary action. These scattered accounts quickly formed a dark picture of the culture of complicity and abuse of power within the department. Every recorded sentence, every flicker of doubt in their eyes was preserved as a crucial piece exposing the buried truth. From these early testimonies, a string of misconduct began to unravel. Beyond Miller's slap, disciplinary records of other officers were unearthed, revealing a pattern of incidents previously brushed aside. Internal reports, once considered missing, were found in archives, detailing cases of excessive force, suspect assault, and witness intimidation, all rewritten in sanitized language. Each document wiped off layers of dust, revealing the true face of a system long masked under the pretense of justice. The press quickly seized on the revelations. Investigative reports were published in succession, naming officers implicated in past misconduct. Riverstone residents were stunned to see familiar faces from their daily lives now featured on blacklists linked to serious accusations. Stories once whispered within the community emerged in full view, intensifying public outrage. What started as an isolated incident had now opened the door to an entrenched web of abuse spanning years. FBI agents patiently pieced together the evidence, cross-referencing every detail, reconstructing the larger picture. Each time a former officer confessed or was cornered by proof, public trust in the investigation deepened. The yellow evidence tape outside the courthouse no longer symbolized secrecy. It became a sign that truth was finally surfacing. In the public's eyes, this was no longer a case about a single slap, but a necessary reckoning, a turning point forcing an entire system to bow before the truth. As the federal investigation dug deeper and more evidence of cover-ups within the police department and years of misconduct came to light, a different wave of response began to emerge from inside the system. The Riverstone Police Union, a powerful organization in protecting officers, quickly issued an official statement. They claimed Officer Miller had been set up, that the slap in court was merely a spontaneous reaction in a tense situation, exaggerated by the media. The union president stood before the cameras, voice firm, face heavy with seriousness, declaring, "We will not allow a dedicated officer to be sacrificed to public pressure." This statement immediately ignited controversy, as it exposed a sharp divide between those seeking justice and those determined to shield their own, regardless of the evidence. The press did not overlook this development. In numerous analyses, experts pointed out that the union was deliberately crafting a false narrative, painting Miller as the victim of a political setup. News networks aired contrasting footage of the union's statement against the court security footage that perfectly matched the viral clip. That contradiction enraged many, as it showed a force meant to uphold public order openly defying the truth. Meanwhile, several local judges also voiced opinions downplaying the incident. They claimed the slap wasn't serious and not enough to invalidate the legitimacy of the trial. These remarks, made in brief interviews, carried heavy weight because they revealed that parts of the judiciary were still choosing to side with power over justice. One judge even argued that excessive public attention was the real threat, saying it endangered the stability of the system. That reasoning only fueled public backlash. Protesters took to the streets carrying new signs: "A slap is assault," and "Silence is complicity." These bold messages lined the squares where thousands gathered and chanted, facing directly the buildings that housed the union and the courts. They came to remind everyone that the slap was not a minor detail, but an act of symbolic violence that struck directly at justice and public trust. Inside the ranks, tensions ran just as high. Some younger officers felt conflicted about the union's absolute defense of Miller. Quietly, they admitted to one another that the truth was undeniable, but feared that speaking up could mean the end of their careers. Fear-driven silence still loomed, but a few began leaking information to the press, hoping that the truth could still find its way through a different path. Within the legal community, outrage spread quickly. Many asserted that the police union and the group of judges were trying to drag the wheels of justice backward. They wrote lengthy analyses pointing out that if the slap were deemed not serious, it would pave the way for a range of violent acts in courtrooms to be legitimized. That would be a direct blow to the Constitution and the foundational principles of a nation that claims to be built on justice. With each passing day, the internal conflict grew more intense. On one side was the pressure of national public opinion demanding strict accountability. On the other was the persistent resistance from the police union and certain judges determined to preserve the old system. This battle was no longer just about Amara Lewis and that fateful slap, but had become a war between two ideologies, upholding the truth or continuing to wear a false mask to protect power. And this very conflict pushed the federal investigation further. As the clearer the evidence became, the more blatant the opposition appeared, and the more determined the public grew to make the system pay. Outside the Riverstone County Courthouse, the crowd grew larger and angrier. From early morning, groups gathered carrying hand-painted signs, loudspeakers, and placards featuring Amara with the red words, "Justice for Commander Lewis." Chants echoed from block to block, merging with the angry beat of drums pounding against the courthouse's aging walls. Police barricades were set up to maintain order, but officers now faced thousands of furious eyes. The protest wasn't just against Miller. It was aimed directly at the entire system that had shielded him. Protesters raised signs reading, "A slap is assault," and "Your silence protects no one." Slogans shouted repeatedly like hammers striking the conscience of society. The crowd kept growing as people poured in from nearby neighborhoods and cities across the state. Convoys pulled over along the road, passengers joining the protest, clogging the street leading to the courthouse. Those who had stayed silent before now stepped forward, fueled by long-held anger. A group of college students pitched tents on the sidewalk, declaring they would stay until justice was served. Veterans in old uniforms stood in formation, hands over hearts as the national anthem played from a mobile speaker, their eyes burning with both fury and pride that there were still people brave enough to rise. The media captured every moment, cameras sweeping from the furious sea of protesters to the American flags snapping atop the courthouse roof. These images were broadcast nationwide, turning Riverstone into the center of attention. A CNN reporter delivered a live update with chants of "Amara" rising so loudly behind him that they nearly drowned out his voice. The atmosphere was described as boiling over like a storm surrounding the heart of the justice system. Political pressure began to escalate as the protests turned into a real force against lawmakers. State legislators received thousands of calls and emails from constituents demanding concrete action. Many politicians were forced to change their tone from silence or ambiguity to publicly condemning Miller's actions. One senator stated on live television, "We cannot allow a slap to the face of a senior military officer to become a symbol of justice's impotence." That statement was widely quoted, becoming a powerful political voice pushing the investigation further. Inside the state legislature, intense debates erupted. Some representatives tried to downplay the issue, fearing that public outrage might destabilize the system. But most, under pressure from voters, had no room to retreat. They knew that silence would mean losing the trust of millions. Special committees were formed, files were rushed to the Federal Department of Justice, and the summoning of additional witnesses became unavoidable. With each passing day, the anger on the streets burned hotter against the backs of politicians. Every press conference, every speech was scrutinized, and any vague statement was immediately met with harsh criticism. The public was no longer just demanding justice for Amara, but calling for reform of the entire system that allowed a police officer to act violently in the middle of a courtroom. The unrelenting protests turned Riverstone into the political flashpoint of the nation, where all eyes were fixed to see whether justice could overcome the entrenched resistance of power. Public pressure and growing protests forced the state legislature to hold a special hearing. News of the event was announced just 3 days after thousands took to the streets, and it immediately drew national attention. The main chamber of the Riverstone State Assembly was prepared in haste, its long rows packed with reporters, television cameras lined along both sides, and security reinforcements far exceeding the usual. Citizens lined up from early morning, many holding signs bearing the now familiar slogans "Justice for Amara" and "Truth has no color," hoping to witness what they believed would be a historic moment. Amara Lewis arrived on time, and the moment she entered the hearing room, the entire hall fell silent. She wore a deep Navy SEAL uniform, epaulets adorned with shining stars, a neat row of medals quietly affirming her rank and service. The overhead lights cast a dignified glow on her, starkly contrasting the woman with blood on her lip in the viral video. Her eyes were steady, her steps firm, neither rushed nor hesitant, as if walking onto a familiar battlefield. The cameras followed her every move, capturing the image of an officer who showed no fear, fully prepared to face the entire system. As Amara took the witness chair, the murmurs in the gallery ceased completely. The presiding official briefly introduced the purpose of the hearing, then asked Amara to deliver her statement. She lifted her head, her voice clear and steady. "I am here today not to defend my personal reputation, but to remind everyone that justice exists only when truth is respected." Her opening words left many in the room breathless. Her gaze swept across the rows of lawmakers, pausing on a few faces known for downplaying Miller's actions. Her eyes cold and sharp, as if demanding they bow to the truth. Throughout her testimony, Amara spoke little of herself. She recounted what happened in the courtroom, every detail of the insult, the judge's silence, and the complicity of everyone present. She emphasized that the slap was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a long-standing illness in the system, where power hides behind silence. When an officer can strike a witness in plain sight without being stopped, that is no longer a single act of misconduct. It is a sign that justice is collapsing, she said slowly but firmly. The chamber was wrapped in tense silence. Many lawmakers exchanged glances, their faces stiffening. Some reporters scribbled furiously, with phrases like "collapse of justice" and "systemic silence" filling their notebooks. Outside in the square, where citizens watched the hearing live on a large screen, cheers erupted with every forceful sentence Amara delivered, turning the plaza into an echo chamber of the witness's word. Amara ended with a brief message. "I once swore to protect this country on the battlefield. Today, I stand here to reaffirm that oath. No one can bury the truth." The statement prompted many in the chamber to rise in a standing ovation, the applause stretching out, booming under the domed ceiling. It was no longer personal support, but a collective recognition of a symbol newly etched into history. As Amara stepped away from the witness chair, walking down the center aisle to continued applause, the moment was broadcast across national television. Many news outlets commented that the scene had gone beyond the scope of a hearing. It had become a public declaration of truth's power. From that moment forward, pressure on those in power no longer came only from crowds in the streets, but directly from within the system itself. Amara paused after recounting the events in Riverstone, her eyes sweeping across the lawmakers once more. The hearing room tensed, as if everyone held their breath. She took a deep breath, her voice lowered but unwavering, every word piercing like a spear. "I served this nation to protect justice, not to fear lies." The statement echoed beneath the dome, falling into the audience like an unshakable oath. It was more than testimony. It was a declaration of purpose, the reason behind a life devoted to defending what is right. The silence that followed was heavy, compressed like the moment before fireworks explode. Lawmakers in the front rows bowed their heads slightly, some biting their lips, others quietly tapping pens against the table, all forced to confront the raw truth they had long avoided. Among the audience, a few closed their eyes, hands clenched, as if her words struck something buried deep within them. Then, suddenly, applause erupted from one corner of the chamber, at first scattered, hesitant, but quickly building, person by person rising. Gray hair beside youthful faces, until the entire room stood in a wave. The thunderous clapping rolled through every row, echoing off the high arches, shaking the very ceiling. Porters clicked their shutters non-stop, capturing the moment when hundreds stood tall, hands clapping red with force, eyes fixed on Amara. Television cameras zoomed in, broadcasting the scene live across the nation. Outside in the square, where thousands were watching on a large screen, cheers erupted, blending with the applause inside. A middle-aged woman burst into tears, hugging her young daughter tightly and saying, "You must remember this. This is what real justice looks like." Amara remained seated, back straight, eyes unwavering, lips pressed gently together. She didn't smile, didn't nod, letting the applause carry on as if it weren't for her alone, but for everyone who had ever been buried in silence. That moment transcended the boundaries of a hearing, becoming a collective affirmation that justice can be distorted, but it can also be rebuilt through the courage of one person. The applause lasted for several minutes, drowning out the gavel of the chairperson trying to restore order. No one wanted to sit down. No one wanted to stop, because they knew they were living through a moment that would be etched into history. And when the sound finally began to fade, its echo lingered in everyone's chest, like the closing note of a song marking the beginning of change. That day, Riverstone was no longer just the site of a scandal, but the focal point where citizens and lawmakers together witnessed the rebirth of belief. Amara didn't need to speak another word, because her brief statement and the prolonged applause had already made her an unshakable symbol. As the echoes of the special hearing continued to reverberate across headlines, the federal investigation suddenly released a series of new documents, sending another shockwave through public opinion. Among the witnesses present at Riverstone, a middle-aged man who had previously remained silent during the hearings came forward to the FBI with a statement. He admitted to being threatened multiple times by Miller, not only verbally, but with direct physical intimidation. He once jabbed his finger into my forehead and said, "If I opened my mouth, no one could guarantee I'd walk out of the courtroom alive," the man recounted shakily in front of a camera. His story quickly became the center of public discourse, as it proved that Miller's violence wasn't a sudden outburst, but a long-standing pattern of abuse. Investigators continued to uncover a trove of long-buried records. Within them were numerous complaints against Miller, ranging from abuse of authority and assaulting suspects to manipulating witness statements. There were even detailed reports linking him to at least 3 civil lawsuits, in which victims claimed they were beaten while in handcuffs. Yet all these files had either gone missing or were dismissed for insufficient evidence, buried under layers of internal protection. Now, as each page came to light, the public began to understand that the slap against Amara was merely the final drop in a long overflowing cup of unchecked misconduct. The press mobilized. Investigative articles piled up, exposing more and more. One major newspaper ran the headline, "Miller, from badge to bully," alongside a list of previously reported incidents. The people of Riverstone were outraged to read details they had never been told, especially the revelation that many victims were vulnerable individuals with no means to defend themselves. A young woman recounted being forced by Miller to sign a false statement in exchange for temporary freedom, or else face arbitrary detention. These testimonies landed like blades, cutting deeper into the public's already shaken trust in the local police department. In the state legislature, these documents became undeniable proof, silencing those who had once defended Miller. Lawmakers, who had previously dismissed the slap as not serious, found it difficult to justify their stance in the face of a lengthy list of concealed misconduct. Crowds gathered outside the police union headquarters, chanting, "Read the files," and "No more silence." The chants echoed, cracking through the once impenetrable shield of institutional protection. The FBI announced it would expand the investigation, targeting not just Miller, but also the officials and officers who had taken part in covering up his actions. One agent stated, "The truth doesn't stop at one individual, but at the entire network that allowed that behavior to persist." That declaration was broadcast live, further fueling the belief that this time the investigation would not be stopped halfway. Amara followed the developments in silence, but her face reflected unwavering determination. The documents being revealed not only validated what she had endured, but also brought long overdue justice to numerous victims who had been forced into silence. For them, Amara's decision to speak out opened a door through which justice, though delayed, finally arrived with dignity. The growing stack of exposed records quickly became vivid evidence that the slap in the courtroom was never an isolated act. It was the result of a system that had long enabled abuse, and now, with each page brought to light, the wall of silence built over the years was beginning to collapse. People no longer felt they were fighting for one individual, but for transparency and justice across society. From there, the story in Riverstone entered a new chapter, where the truth was no longer trapped in the shadows of sealed files, but made public as an indictment against an entire system that once believed itself untouchable. Old case files, once thought forgotten, now turned into a fire consuming the power structure in Riverstone. When the list of misconduct cases tied to Miller was released, the investigation's focus extended far beyond him. Numerous officials within the county court began to be named. Those who had signed off on vague reports, ignored evidence, or directly ordered the removal of damaging details. Interrogations followed one after another, involving court clerks and retired judges, all required to explain how the complaints against Miller had disappeared from the system. In each session, the same responses echoed, "I don't recall," or "It was a directive from above." But when those statements were laid next to the original documents, the lies became impossible to hide. Public outrage erupted as specific names came into the spotlight. A former district attorney was accused of intentionally delaying at least 2 civil lawsuits tied to Miller in exchange for political support from the police union. One judge, who had presided over a previous police brutality case, was exposed through internal emails stating, "This is minor, not worth making noise about." The community of Riverstone was furious to learn that those entrusted with protecting justice had, in fact, built the very wall shielding wrongdoing. Public pressure made that wall impossible to sustain. Protests outside the county courthouse now carried new slogans, directly targeting officials by name. Name the judge, name the lie. Citizens demanded a full list of those involved be released, refusing to tolerate any further silence. Under mounting media scrutiny, several officials were forced to resign, while others were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The media described that moment as the collapse of the wall of silence that had shrouded Riverstone for decades. The way each piece of the scandal emerged resembled a decaying house being torn apart, every brick falling to reveal a rotten foundation. Witnesses, who had once remained silent out of fear, began to speak up, sending emails, making phone calls, even appearing publicly on television to recount how Miller and his colleagues had threatened them. Each new story stoked public outrage, but also stood as proof that fear was finally beginning to fade. Silence, once seen as a shield, has now become a burden for those who had chosen it. Human rights lawyers likened it to gripping sand. The tighter you hold it, the faster it slips through your fingers. The entire system in Riverstone shook as each link in the chain of complicity was dismantled. The wall that had once protected Miller no longer stood intact, breaking apart under the massive pressure from the public and the relentless push of the federal investigation. Amara watched the events unfold on screen, feeling a weight in her chest yet also a sense of peace. What she endured was only the visible tip, but the collapse of the wall of silence proved that her decision to stand up had sparked a seismic reckoning. Riverstone was no longer the same, and those who once believed power could shield them now trembled in the face of truth. It was a moment when history carved another line, where what seemed like a single slap became the hammer blow that shattered an entire fortress of deceit. The day of Miller's sentencing became a nationally watched event. The federal court scheduled the trial under tight security, with hundreds of reporters crowding the gates and thousands of citizens lining both sides of the street holding signs demanding justice. This trial was unlike the previous ones, no more averted eyes or complicit silence, but a strict atmosphere where every procedure was carried out under public and media scrutiny. When Miller entered the courtroom, his face tense, wrists shackled in shining cuffs, the crowd outside roared, "Justice for Amara," their voices echoing through the glass panes. Prosecutors presented evidence one after another, from the viral clip to security camera footage, along with testimony from numerous witnesses. They painted a clear picture. A police officer assaulted a witness in open court, then lied to cover it up. The feeble defense from Miller's attorney couldn't blur the overwhelming chain of evidence. When witnesses stood to recount how they were threatened, the courtroom was steeped in outrage. The once proud image of Miller now looked diminished, hunched over in the defendant's seat, sweat beading under harsh lights. The final verdict was delivered in a firm voice. Miller was found guilty of assault and perjury, sentenced to prison with no possibility of appeal. The clear, decisive words triggered a wave of relief in the courtroom, followed by uncontrollable applause. Outside, the crowd erupted, hugging one another as if they had survived a long battle and justice had finally prevailed. The live broadcast captured the moment, showing a police officer who once believed himself untouchable brought to heel by the law. The shock didn't stop there. The next announcement hit just as hard. The presiding judge of the original trial, who had stayed silent while Miller acted with impunity and ignored the slap in court, was officially suspended. The decision wasn't just a punishment for one individual, it was a message to the entire system that complicity is also a crime. The people of Riverstone welcomed the news with excitement, having long believed those in high positions never faced consequences. Now, the wall that once shielded the powerful had cracked, opening a path to hope that justice does not discriminate by rank or uniform. International media called it a historic verdict, not only for the sentence handed to Miller, but for how it struck at the roots of the issue, the silence of the court and the system's protection of its own. Major headlines ran the phrase, "No one above the law," turning it into a symbol for the justice movement spreading across the U.S. In the eyes of the people, it marked a milestone, proving that a long, grueling fight was finally beginning to bring real change. Amara did not appear on sentencing day, but her name was chanted thousands of times outside the courthouse. She quietly followed the proceedings on a screen, her eyes reflecting a mix of determination and rare relief. The final verdict did not erase what she had endured, but it stood as proof that taking a stand had not been in vain. And in the moment Miller was led out of the courtroom, the prison doors slamming shut behind him, Riverstone knew that history had turned a new page, where justice was no longer just a slogan, but a force being truly enforced. After Miller's sentence was read, the courtroom held its breath in tense silence. The prosecutor returned to the podium, voice calm but firm, stating that the charges brought against Amara Lewis were entirely baseless, fabricated through Miller's lies and falsified reports. The presiding judge declared solemnly, "Amara Lewis is innocent. All charges against her are dismissed. Her honor and full civil standing are hereby restored." In that moment, thunderous applause erupted, and tears welled in the eyes of those who had followed the case from the beginning. In the audience, several veterans stood tall, saluting as if greeting a comrade returned from battle. Amara sat still for a moment, her hand clenched into a fist before relaxing. She did not cry, did not smile, but her eyes burned like fire. She knew that the declaration of innocence did more than clear her name. It erased the stain that Miller and the system had tried to force upon her. On live television, the image of Amara in uniform, back straight and head held high, became the stark contrast to Miller's bowed figure leaving the courtroom. Two fates, two paths, and one verdict that drew the line between deceit and truth. The news spread quickly. Major networks ran headlines like "Commander Lewis Vindicated" and "Justice Restored." On social media, millions shared the moment the judge read the statement, accompanied by heartfelt comments. Many wrote, "She didn't just reclaim her own honor, she reclaimed it for everyone ever crushed by injustice." The hashtag #Justice for Amara turned into #Victory for Amara, marking a shift in the movement from outrage to pride. The verdict was soon described by scholars and media alike as a historic milestone, not only because it closed a trial, but because it opened the door to confront the system's deeper flaws. Many editorials argued that from now on, no act of abuse inside a courtroom could be dismissed as a minor incident. Amara's case would be included in legal and civic education, a lasting reminder that justice cannot exist where truth is buried. In Riverstone, the central square lit up at night as thousands of residents gathered to celebrate the victory. Flags were held high, chants echoed loudly, and red flares lit up the sky. It was not a celebration like after a sports game, but as if the city had reclaimed a piece of its soul that had been shrouded in darkness for too long. Among the crowd, many held up pictures of Amara with the words, "Truth has no color," treating it as a way of life. In Washington, several lawmakers called the verdict a wake-up call. They admitted that the Riverstone case exposed dangerous blind spots in the system, forcing a reckoning. A police conduct reform bill was proposed shortly afterward, citing Amara as a key example. This showed that the verdict extended beyond a single incident and had the power to influence national policy and legislation. Amara appeared on the covers of major magazines, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resistance. She didn't give many speeches, only repeating one sentence: "I swore to protect justice," and today, justice was protected. The words rang out simply, but carried deep weight, reinforcing the meaning behind the verdict. The court's final ruling was not just a personal vindication, but a declaration to millions that justice may be delayed, may be hard-fought, but it never disappears. Riverstone has since been remembered in history as the place where truth prevailed, and Amara Lewis is remembered not just as a Navy SEAL commander, but as the woman who turned a slap into a verdict against an entire system, closing a dark chapter and opening a new era of belief. When the final verdict was read, Riverstone was no longer the quiet town it once was. Every road leading to the county courthouse was packed people, flags and banners waving in the wind, chants of "Justice for All" echoing off the old brick walls and spreading across the square. From silver-haired elders to children perched on their parents' shoulders, everyone joined the chant, as if singing a collective anthem of justice. No one mentioned Amara's name alone anymore, because the story had grown beyond a single individual. It had become a symbol of shared hope. The words "Justice for All" appeared on T-shirts, fabric flags, and even drawn in chalk along park pathways. Street artists used brick walls to paint murals of Amara in uniform, standing tall during the hearing, her eyes resolute. These murals quickly became gathering points where people stopped to take photos and told their children that Riverstone had witnessed a day when justice came alive. The impact didn't end with rallies in the streets. In schools, the story of Amara and the courtroom slap entered classroom discussions. High school students debated fiercely about the meaning of silence and courage, some saying that if they'd been in that room, they wouldn't have stayed quiet. Teachers encouraged essays on "Justice has no color," and many deeply emotional pieces were published in student newspapers, spreading widely online. At universities, small forums formed, with law students dissecting the legal details of the case, while sociology majors explored race and power dynamics. These weren't just academic debates, they became real lessons in civic responsibility. Community groups seized the moment to launch new initiatives. Parent-teacher associations created the Voices of Riverstone Forum, where anyone who had faced injustice could share their story. Human rights organizations started fundraising campaigns to support victims of police violence, and donations surged thanks to widespread empathy. Online platforms are flooded with videos, podcasts, and articles about the case, keeping the conversation burning bright. International media kept spotlighting the movement's reach. A British newspaper described the Riverstone wave as a small ripple that could begin a national tide, pointing to its potential for countrywide reform. News outlets in Asia and Africa called Amara a global symbol in the fight against injustice. In major cities outside the U.S., people also raised "Justice for All" signs during their own marches, turning the Riverstone story into a source of cross-border inspiration. Inside the Riverstone community, the most valuable change was that fear had vanished. Those who once once lived in silence now dared to speak up more. A woman stood in the center of the square, holding a microphone handed by the organizers, her voice trembling as she shared how her husband had once been threatened by police, and, for the first time, she no longer feared the judgmental eyes of the authorities. The crowd listened, then erupted in applause, turning a personal story into collective strength. In that aftermath, Amara didn't appear often, but her name was tied to every slogan, every mural, every discussion. She became a symbol, but it was the community that became the extended hand keeping that symbol alive. Riverstone had changed, from a place that buried the truth to a beacon for the nation, and the chant, "Justice for All," continued to echo, not as a passing slogan, but as a reminder that justice only matters when it is safeguarded in everyone's heart. As "Justice for All" echoed across Riverstone, minority communities within the city and across the country began reclaiming a faith they thought was lost. After years of living under the shadow of discrimination and abuse of power, many had grown used to silence, believing it was the only way to survive. But after Amara's case, a new door opened. In her image, they didn't just see a vindicated individual, they saw living proof that even a broken system could be forced to bow to the truth. Communities, once pushed to the margins, now found a shared voice, standing together, stronger and no longer hesitant. In community gatherings, many people began to share their own stories, from random street searches to contemptuous looks in courtrooms, where once they only whispered within their families, now those stories were told openly before packed halls. Amara's presence, as a Navy SEAL commander who had faced both battlefields and courtrooms, stood as proof that dignity and pride could not be stripped away. Minority rights groups looked to her as a spiritual anchor, declaring that collective silence had been shattered and would not return. From pain of being insulted, dismissed, grew a powerful source of inspiration. People of color looked at Amara and saw themselves in her, the false suspicion, the cruel ridicule, the unjust rulings. But instead of letting those wounds linger, they turned them into fuel for action. A group of black college students at a local university formed Next Voices, a program dedicated to training high schoolers in debate and legal literacy. Their goal was simple: to ensure the next generation would never again be silenced in the face of injustice. Not only the black community, but also Asian and Latin American immigrant groups found deep resonance in Amara's story. They began organizing intercultural forums, where people who once had little in common now sat side by side to share experiences and strategies for confronting discrimination. From scattered fragments, a new network of solidarity emerged, carrying strength that transcended skin color and language. The Riverstone incident became a catalyst, bringing communities long divided by prejudice closer than ever before. In popular culture, pain turned into a source of creative inspiration. Young artists wrote songs, staged plays, and produced documentaries to tell the story in their own language. On city walls, images of Amara in uniform appeared alongside the slogan, "From Pain to Power," a declaration that tragedy is not an end, but the beginning of strength. Every time these works surfaced, they served as a reminder that the Riverstone case was not a landmark event, but a turning point for resistance and the pursuit of justice. Amara remained silent, but her silence was no longer a shadow. It was a calm that allowed the story to shine on its own. Her name came up in classrooms, in lectures, in personal journals. The name Amara Lewis was no longer just tied to the pain of a slap in court, but had become a symbol of renewed faith. From suffering, the community found strength. From insult, they built inspiration. And from one shocking trial, they learned to stand tall, to speak up, and to believe that justice could belong to everyone. When the Riverstone case concluded with a historic verdict, the academic world immediately recognized it as a new milestone in civil rights. Constitutional law experts called it a living precedent. because it did not stop at a single ruling, but opened up broader questions about the balance of power and the responsibility to oversee the judicial system. Professors at top law schools began analyzing every detail, from the investigation process and courtroom proceedings to the way public pressure forced systemic change. They affirmed that this story would serve as a foundation for new research on justice and the protection of individual rights. At many universities, academic forums were organized where students debated not only legal statutes, but also ethical and social implications. One professor told his class, "The Amara Lewis case teaches us that justice does not exist in silence. It is created by voices that dare to challenge." Those words were recorded and widely quoted in legal journals and mainstream media. The event was no longer a standalone story. It had become a case study in civil rights education, placed alongside landmark cases that reshaped American legal history. Books and journalism quickly joined in. Prominent writers recounted the entire timeline in investigative features, recreating every detail from the slap in the courtroom to the moment Amara was declared innocent. Several newspapers published special editions, including editorials emphasizing that justice only holds value when it serves all citizens, regardless of race or status. Some publishers began writing books, turning the case into reference material not only for law students but for teachers, journalists, and social activists as well. In high schools, the Riverstone case was introduced into curricula as a vivid lesson in human rights. Teachers used the viral video to start class, then encouraged students to discuss civil liberties, courage, and the role of community in defending justice. For many students, it was the first time the law felt like more than abstract theory. It became something that could directly touch their lives. Essays and presentations about Amara appeared more frequently, turning her story into an educational inspiration that went far beyond the courtroom. In the broader academic culture, this story became an interdisciplinary teaching resource. Sociology departments analyzed how minority communities reclaimed their trust. Communications departments studied the role of social media in shifting public perception. And political science departments dissected how public opinion influenced political decisions. The Riverstone event, therefore, was not just a landmark, comprehensive case study that connected multiple fields and offered lasting lessons for future generations. Amara herself was invited to speak at several university forums, where she did not talk about military victories, but about her experience confronting injustice. Her story helped students understand that justice is not an abstract concept, but something that must be protected through specific actions, from standing up in court to speaking the truth in a crowd. Her simple yet powerful words turned Amara into a figure featured in textbooks as a living example of integrity. In this way, Riverstone was no longer remembered merely as a town marked by police scandal, but as the birthplace of a profound lesson in justice. From the slap that ignited public outrage to the verdict that affirmed the truth, everything was rewritten, preserved, and taught as a legacy for future generations, to remember that justice is not a gift, but the result of courage and human solidarity. As lectures and research across the United States began to frame the Riverstone case as a legal landmark, the story's message spread beyond national borders to regions also confronting injustice. In Europe, where immigrant communities still face discrimination, the media highlighted Amara as proof that resistance against oppression can succeed. International human rights conferences cited Riverstone as a clear example that justice can be hidden. But when a community unites, the wall of silence can still fall. In South Africa, where the legacy of apartheid remains vivid, major newspapers called Amara the voice of a new era, a symbol of determination against all forms of discrimination. The story also reached Asia, where many nations have a history of civil rights struggles. appeals. Numerous editorials stressed that Riverstone was not merely an American issue, but a shared human lesson on how justice can be twisted by power and prejudice. Social activists in India, the Philippines, and South Korea held forums screening the video of Amara being slapped in court to discuss the need for transparency and witness protection. In Latin America, law students used the case to compare with injustices in their own countries, seeking ways to strengthen community oversight. In this way, the Riverstone event became a catalyst for global dialogue. What allowed this message to break through every barrier was the simple phrase, "Amara left behind." Truth has no color. That statement appeared on banners, t-shirts, rap lyrics, and murals, becoming the slogan tied to a global movement for justice. It did not just reflect the pain of a slap in a courtroom, but carried the universal truth that truth itself does not discriminate by skin color, gender, or social status. Each time it was repeated, it reminded people everywhere that justice only holds value when it stands on the foundation of truth. Many international organizations embraced Amara's words as a spiritual beacon. At a human rights forum, the United Nations quoted the phrase verbatim, adopting it as a motto for the global fight against discrimination. Politicians in various countries cited it in their speeches, turning "truth has no color" into a timeless political maxim. On social media, the phrase was shared millions of times, not just in connection with the Riverstone case, but in countless situations where citizens demanded fair treatment. For many young people, those words became a personal philosophy. They used it to affirm that justice is not a privilege for a select group, but a basic right for all. Numerous international student movements saw Amara as a symbol, launching media campaigns with her image alongside the words, "Truth has no color," against a multicolored flag. From one simple sentence, Amara unintentionally ignited a global flame, allowing truth to transcend borders, languages, and cultures. From the small town of Riverstone, that message spread worldwide, turning one humiliating slap into a global lesson. It didn't just restore the dignity of a black woman, but also reaffirm the belief that wherever truth is spoken, justice can take root. And in the echo of the words, "Truth has no color," the world understood that while justice can be obscured for a moment, it never disappears. When the noise finally began to fade, Amara had time to sit and face herself. The past months played back like a slow-motion film, from the moment Miller humiliated her in the courthouse hallway to the thunderous slap before a sea of cold stares, then to the endless flood of hashtags surging across social media. She realized her path didn't begin at that trial, but years earlier, when she silently endured suspicious glances because of her skin color and gender, even while wearing the uniform of a Navy SEAL. Silence had once been her shield, a way to protect herself, but it was also a chain that kept her from speaking. Now, after everything, Amara understood that silence is never an escape. In that moment alone, she recalled the phrase that had echoed in her mind so many times. Courage isn't absence of fear, it's standing despite it. She had felt fear, hesitation, the heavy weight of darkness closing in on her in that narrow courtroom. But what made her who she is today wasn't the lack of fear, it was choosing to stand tall even when fear remained. She had stood there to face it, to endure, and to prove that courage is an action, not a feeling. That phrase followed her from the military training grounds to the witness stand, and now it had become her way of life. Amara also looked back on her days in uniform, where strict discipline had shaped her into a soldier, yet nothing prepared her to fight a public battle on her own soil. The scars on her body came from brutal missions, but the wound inflicted in court hurt the most. It was Miller's slap that made her fully understand that enemies don't only exist on distant battlefields, they can also live within the very legal system meant to protect citizens. That contrast turned Amara's journey into a complete portrait of courage, fighting both visible enemies and invisible prejudice. When she was exonerated, Amara didn't see herself as a victorious victim, but as someone who had completed a full circle, from silence to pride, from humiliation to honor. She knew recognition couldn't erase the memory of disgrace, but it gave meaning to the pain. The price she paid was steep, yet it opened a door for thousands of others to rediscover hope. Her personal journey, therefore, no longer belonged only to her, but became a piece of a greater picture, one where justice is redefined through courage and perseverance. In a rare moment of peace, Amara smiled softly, not because everything was over, but because she knew she no longer lived in silence. Pride wasn't a medal pinned to her chest, but the ability to face the truth without bowing to it. From a ridiculed witness, she had stepped into the light as a symbol, not because she sought glory, but because she refused to let the truth be buried. That journey, with all its wounds and victories, stood as living proof. Courage always begins the moment someone chooses to rise, even when their heart still trembles in the dark. As Amara emerged from those long, tense days, what moved her most wasn't the applause of strangers, but the familiar eyes of loved ones and fellow soldiers. Her family appeared at a small memorial ceremony in Riverstone, held by the community to honor her courage. Her father, now gray-haired and a veteran himself, looked at her with pride and sorrow, gripping her hand tightly as if to pass on strength. Her mother, the quiet presence behind Amara's tough military path, couldn't hold back tears, embracing her longer than ever before. For Amara, that moment meant more than any medal, because it confirmed she no longer fought alone. Former comrades from the military came as well, faces that had once stood beside her on the training grounds and battlefield. They didn't say much, simply stood at attention and saluted, and Amara returned the gesture with teary eyes. These were people who had survived gunfire together, now standing to tell her that this fight mattered just as much as any mission abroad. Some shared that they'd never seen the public admire a Navy SEAL the way they admired Amara, not for victories overseas, but for her unwavering strength on American soil. The presence of her family and fellow soldiers gave Amara's personal journey a collective shape. From a lone woman standing in court, she had become the anchor connecting many lives. To the military, she represented honor. To her family, she was pride. To the community, a symbol. Every hug, every glance, every word of support transformed Amara from a shamed witness into a shared image of unified strength. From that moment on, Amara was no longer just an individual in the public's eyes, but a mirror for millions. In her, they saw the belief that justice could be reclaimed, that truth could prevail over distortion. That symbol wasn't created by media or slogans, but by the pain and strength she had endured. And as her family, comrades, and community stood beside her, Amara understood she no longer represented herself alone, but an entire generation's yearning for fairness, making her story a shared legacy, inspiring the next steps of society. After everything, Amara's story did not end with a verdict or a fleeting symbol. It planted seeds for a new generation. Many young people chose to pursue military service, carrying Amara's image as their guiding star. They looked to her, a Navy SEAL commander who stood firm against injustice and understood that serving the country was not just about going to war, but about defending honor and protecting justice for their own people. At enlistment ceremonies, her name was spoken like a quiet promise that the next generation would continue the path carved by courage. At universities, Amara's influence spread in a different way. Student-led movements against racism and injustice grew stronger than ever. Student groups formed clubs focused on civil rights, creating open forums to hear voices from various communities. Posters of Amara, with the quote, "Truth has no color," appeared across campus hallways, reminding students that knowledge could not be separated from justice. Lively debates were held, where law, sociology, and political science students dissected the Riverstone case as a real-world lesson. That spirit quickly moved beyond the university and into the broader community. Students joined social efforts, from peaceful protests to grassroots projects aimed at raising awareness about racial injustice. Some student groups volunteered to visit high schools to share Amara's story, encouraging younger generations to speak up against unfairness. This ripple effect turned the story into a catalyst for the social justice movement, infusing it with youthful energy, passion, and unstoppable momentum. The emergence of young recruits inspired by Amara's courage, alongside the fervent student movement against injustice, proved that her legacy had grown beyond any one individual. It had become the foundation for a new generation, one unafraid to stand tall, to take action, and to believe that justice is not some distant idea. That generation, armed with courage and a thirst for knowledge, is the bridge forward, turning Amara's story into a living legacy, where each step they take reaffirms that truth and justice will always have a place in society. After the case closed, one of the most concrete and impactful steps was the creation of a support fund for victims of abuse of power. The fund was established by human rights organizations with help from individuals involved in the Justice for All movement. On its launch day, hundreds gathered at Riverstone Square, holding signs with Amara's name as a tribute. The fund aimed not only to provide financial assistance to victims of authority abuse, but also legal services, psychological counseling, and training programs to help them rebuild trust. Donations poured in rapidly, as people believed this was the way to turn outrage into action, to turn Amara's story into a driver for lasting change. The name Amara Lewis, once tied to scandal, has now become a rallying cry at every protest. Phrases like "Stand like Amara" and "Remember Lewis" appeared on banners, T-shirts, and city walls. It no longer referred to a single person, but rose as a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Protests against police brutality across multiple states, crowds chanted "Amara Lewis" in unison, as a declaration that justice must not be forgotten. That chant echoed powerfully, becoming a source of strength for those who dared to confront oppression. On social media, her name spread like a flame that refused to die out. Online fundraising campaigns bearing Amara's name received millions of shares. Videos, articles, and podcasts inspired by her story circulated widely, forming a stream of collective memory. Many street artists used Amara's image as creative fuel, painting her on murals, referencing her in rap songs, and even portraying her in community theater. This turned Amara into more than a figure of the past. She became a living inspiration for the present. The combination of the support fund and protest slogans bearing Amara's name created a solid legacy, proved that what happened had not been forgotten, but transformed into action and symbolism. Amara Lewis is no longer just a name, but a reminder that justice must be defended through both voice and deed, so that from one personal story, society can find collective strength strong enough to shape the future. When Time magazine released its special edition featuring Amara in uniform on the cover, the entire country paused in a moment of quiet pride. That image was more than just a portrait. It was a symbol of the journey from being scorned to being honored, from a victim of abusive power to a model of justice. Amara's eyes on the cover didn't scream, didn't boast, but remained calm, resolute, reflecting strength from within. Beneath the photo, bold letters read, "Justice survives only when we rise against lies." That editorial line captured it all. Justice cannot survive on its own. It only lives when people are willing to rise against deceit. Amara's appearance on Time marked a shift from a controversial event to a cultural legacy. Schools, research institutes and social organizations referenced her as proof of the power of resilience. People spoke about her on television, wrote about her in books and articles, and invoked her name at protests. Her image was no longer tied to the humiliation of a slap, but to a message of courage and truth. The name Amara Lewis became part of the collective memory, a reminder that every citizen has the right to be protected under the law. The editorial accompanying the photo caused a stir by declaring that truth must not only be spoken, but defended through collective action. Those words were quoted in lectures, university classrooms, and even political hearings. The phrase became a guiding principle, reminding society that it can only stand firm if people are brave enough to confront lies. This simple yet powerful message carried Amara's legacy far beyond a single case, turning it into a shared inheritance for humanity. For Amara, her silence after the verdict continued to carry weight. She didn't need to give many speeches because her image and actions had already spoken for her. Her composure ensured that her legacy didn't close like a finished story, but opened as a new chapter for society. Future generations would look to her to learn how to face injustice, how to rise while afraid, and how to believe that justice exists when people refuse to back down. Amara Lewis's legacy, therefore, lives not only on a magazine cover, not only in an editorial, but in the hearts of those who have longed for a more just society. The story may have ended, but its echoes continue to spread, as an enduring reminder that justice survives only when we rise against lies. As public discourse began to quiet, Amara's story did not fade, but instead re-emerged in a more enduring form: books. Major publishers quickly reached out to her, and within a year, several titles were released. Some chronicled every legal detail, others read like narrative nonfiction, and some were written for young adults as lessons in citizenship. On bookstore shelves, the name Amara Lewis stood as evidence of truth's strength, and each page served as a reminder that justice is not the privilege of a few, but the right of all. Not only in legal texts, but even in literature, her image transcended personal boundaries to become a collective symbol. Book launches were always packed, drawing everyone from law students to everyday readers who had followed her story on their phone screens. They came not just to revisit the events, but to feel the inspiration of someone who had once remained silent and then found the courage to rise. Conversations about Amara became open forums where people shared experiences and found motivation to act in their daily lives. The story was translated into many languages, traveling from the Americas to Europe, from Africa to Asia, each place adding its own context, yet echoing the same message. Truth and courage know no borders. From the page to public life, Amara became a cultural icon. Schools used her story as teaching material, human rights organizations embraced it as a communication tool, and communities treated it as a guide for action. Her image appeared on city walls, her name echoed in public speeches, and her famous quote was repeated like a vow before crowds. Each sentence in those books did more than recount pain. It carried forward a dream for a more just society. Among all those legacies, the most resonant was her final message: truth has no color, and courage has no race. This declaration rose above all boundaries to become a global mantra. It told the world that truth does not discriminate by skin tone, courage is not confined by race, and justice can only live when people are brave enough to stand, just as Amara once did. From one courtroom in Riverstone, that message grew into a universal rallying cry, so that whenever injustice rises, society can repeat these words like a torch, lighten the way. And in that echo, the legacy of Amara Lewis is etched not just in books, but in the hearts of all who believe in justice. From the hallways of the Riverstone Courthouse to the cover of Time magazine, Amara Lewis's story completed a journey marked by tears, scars, wounds, and pride. From the moment of humiliation, being slapped in open court under indifferent gazes, to the moment her true identity was revealed and the nation was shaken, Amara turned personal pain into a social turning point. The viral video forced hidden truths into the light, broke down the network of silence, and led to a historic verdict that not only restored her honor, but paved the way for millions to rediscover their faith in justice. The image of Amara in uniform became a symbol of the era, her name a rallying cry in protests, and her words, "Truth has no color, and courage has no race," echoed around the world. From solitude, she found strength in the community, and in return, she became a source of strength for the next generation. Young people enlisted with a renewed belief in fairness. Students built activist movements, and a support fund for victims of abuse of power was established, together forming a living legacy that proved one person's courage can spark change beyond imagination. Amara's story does not just remind us of the harshness of injustice, but also teaches that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. Justice only truly exists when there are people determined to protect it. And the greatest legacy Amara left behind is the belief that anyone, anywhere, can become a voice for truth.